Hello, everyone. Welcome to my channel, Conscious Money, which is about sharing honest resources to get free and clear with money. I'm really excited because my guest today is Alexandria Fisher, who can give you a lot of knowledge and information about working in the ESG sector. Alexandria works as a sustainable finance manager at the Global Risk Institute and has an incredible 10 years of experience working on the institutional side and working in the environmental side of ESG. And she also has studied at the London School of Economics, which I'm very impressed by because in the UK, it's a big deal. Hi, Alexandria, and welcome to the show.
Hi, I'm so happy to join you.
Could you share a little bit about your career journey and how you got into your current role? Because it sounds like quite a good role to get.
Yeah, it's really exciting. So it's kind of where my journey led me. One of the most interesting things was ESG and sustainable finance was not a thing when I studied. So I actually have a degree in environmental studies, as well as my master's of science in environment and development. And corporate social responsibility, CSR, was the thing when I was studying. And once I graduated, I didn't know quite what to do with that. And I was trying to find a way to make impact. So I bounced around between a lot of different roles, between working in waste management and water sustainability, more on the environmental side. And then I landed in an institutional investor around 2015, because that's when the ESG or responsible investment field really started to emerge. And since then, I've been in the ESG space. And when I started, the analyst did everything under the sun. And now everything has kind of become a little bit more siloed and a little bit more nuanced, which is fantastic. The area I decided I loved was ESG risk. So more the quantitative side. And so using those skills, I worked for the government for a while, the government of Alberta, leading ESG work. And now I work for the Global Risk Institute. So it's a think tank that provides institutional investors recommendations on financial system stability. And climate change, obviously, is one of those things now. So it's really exciting to be able to actually be in a space where people are coming to seek knowledge from you rather than you trying to approach them continuously to make change.
Wow, that sounds very intellectually stimulating too. Could you define ESG and how you see it? Because a lot of people are confused by what it actually is.
That is an incredibly hard question. It should be easy. So the way I define ESG is the integration of non-financial performance indicators into decision making. So it's essentially something people should be doing anyway. People should be taking material information into investment decisions, no matter what kind of information it is. But the way I view ESG, I think, is where the debate comes in, because it can mean so many different things to so many different people because there's not a universal definition. And so I divide it into two different categories. So I focus on the process. So ESG integration, ESG risk management, whereas also there's the product side, which I think is where more the controversy comes. And so that's more about your ETFs or mutual funds and where some greenwashing is occurring. And so I think the lack of general understanding has allowed these multiple definitions to proliferate. But at its core, it's a fundamental part. For me, it's a fundamental part of investment decision making.
Thank you. You simplified it quite a bit. I think it's one of those words like money, which can take on a lot of projection and people project meaning onto it. From my conversations with people that work in my industry, I find it quite misunderstood and projected on with the wrong kinds of meaning. Not the wrong, but,
No, absolutely.
Not accurate. Yeah.
So like one of the areas I'm working on now is the backlash against ESG. And most of it comes from like political ideology and kind of a misinformed idea of what ESG is. One interesting thing kind of in the sphere is there's a paper recently published called The End of ESG. And it talks about how ESG should be not something separate. It should just be part of investment decision making. And I think a lot of professionals over the next year or two are going to be starting moving away from the term, even though the fundamental actions will still be the same. It'll be under the banner of risk management or under the banner of reporting rather than using a more like contentious term.
Was that the paper by Alex Edmonds, The End of ESG?
Yes.
Yes.
There is also a newsletter from Matthew Skoll that was talking about it. And I love his quote that says, ESG is nothing and ESG is everything.
Yeah. Quite paradoxical. And anything true is, yes, paradoxical. And Alex Edmonds and you are worth following on LinkedIn and Twitter. Could you talk a little bit about the different kinds of roles within ESG, like data analysis or the product side, the process side, because if people were watching this and thinking of career ideas.
Absolutely. The industry is changing so quickly. So one of the exciting things is the idea of being a generalist still applies, but it's becoming more rare to kind of be an ESG generalist. So there's a couple different career paths you can go down. So one is like into institutional investors. So more the investment decision-making side, being part of a portfolio manager. One example at a bank is being kind of a green investment banker, being involved in like the issuance of green bonds or green products. Also, you can be on the reporting side and disclosure side where you're taking the information from across different organizations. So this role exists in corporates, it exists in institutional investors. Anyone who's kind of involved in ESG, you're seeing it in municipalities as well. They aggregate the information from across the organization and report it to who needs to see it, as well as all the different entities. One key thing that is important is around the communication. So you're taking all this information that might not mean anything to people and reporting in a way that is clear, concise, and consistent. And that's probably one of the areas where there is the most demand at an entry level. But the skills required, I think, are a bit more nuanced in terms of communication because you're dealing with a lot of different people internally and on the surface. And you also have the climate area, and within ESG is absolutely exploding. And within that, you have the climate risk management, you have climate scenario analysis. And so you can kind of sit on the climate team or investment team, or you can sit kind of within the legal team. It really depends how the organization views ESG. The one thing I always say is if you're applying for an ESG role, double check where ESG reports to. So the board should have ultimate responsibility for sustainability at ESG. And if it doesn't, that is a big red flag that the organization doesn't take ESG seriously. And also there's kind of the stakeholder engagement side where you're looking at your shareholder proposals and engaging with companies on behalf of shareholders that actually make change. And that kind of falls into the proxy voting side. We're actually voting the ballots, which is something I did for a couple of years, which is a really good way to get an understanding of how the systems function. My personal favorite, I'm a little biased, is the quantitative ESG risk side. So it brings together all the different subject matters and kind of amalgamates them together to look at systemic risk. That's one of the parts about ESG I find interesting is you're seeing more people specialize in the E or G, but looking at it holistically and the complexity between the different systems is where I find the most interest. Oh, and then, as I probably mentioned, developing the products, like product development and selling the products, which is something I'm probably the most unfamiliar with. The retail side is an area I don't have much expertise.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That's very enlightening. I loved the delight on your face when you talked about the quantitative side. You mentioned something on our previous call about a team, and we were talking about skill set requirements. And I was wondering if maybe you could share something about that.
Yes, this was an idea that I kind of mulled over for a while, but recently saw it formalized in the CFA's Future of Work. So a T skill set is a wide breadth of knowledge and a deep subject matter expertise. Because one of the hard things about coming into the ESG world from kind of the environmental activism or some of the social world is that you don't have the breadth. So working in ESG, you need to be able to understand the concepts or understand the subject matter your peers are dealing with. So one thing I've really had to do over my career is learn about finance and risk management so I can understand their motivations and knowledge and be able to relate my work to that. It's equally important if you're coming in from like a more general finance sphere, you need to be able to figure out how to develop the depth of knowledge within ESG. And that's something I don't think people sometimes fully understand. There's been a lot more discussion around climate competency, in particular ESG competency, where people don't understand some of the complexities around these different systems or how they interact. And having that deep knowledge in areas really allows you to understand the risks and how the systems interact more holistically.
I paid so much attention to your answer that I forgot to look at the next question, which is what's really exciting about working within ESG?
People care. And the culture is generally great. People who are in ESG for the most part want to be here. I find the community is much more friendly and approachable than some other areas I've worked. It's definitely not hierarchical. People who are in the industry will talk to anyone. I know when I worked in government, I got my hand slapped a couple times for talking to people who were like above my, above, what's the high word, but above my hierarchy.
Yeah.
Whereas in ESG, you can virtually approach almost anyone and they'll be really eager to talk to you or at least kind of tell you other resources. Another thing is it's constant problem solving. One of the big skills you need is kind of that creativity, that problem solving, the systems thinking, the critical thinking. Problems are always evolving and are never the same. And the dynamic nature of it is something that I absolutely love.
Really. And I just had a follow-up question to your previous answer, which is how do you keep the breadth of knowledge? Like how do you structure? Because that's a large volume of information to keep up with and books and publications and do you have a system?
I should have a system. For the most part, so my biggest platforms is I use social media a lot and I save the articles either on Twitter or on LinkedIn. And then I constantly scroll. Like the social media is actually where I kind of get the most robust discussions and kind of keep at the cutting edge of what's happening. Like I do check what's happening in academia, but I think some of the most interesting stuff is coming out of where I call like the pracademic space. So not necessarily peer reviewed, but it's like research coming out of different institutions. Because one of the things that's hard connecting academia, sometimes it doesn't reflect the realities of working in these sticky institutions where change is possible.
I did a video on my channel about the CFA ESG exam, and I got so many questions which I'm not equipped to answer because I don't really work in ESG. I work with sustainable investment, which to me is slightly different.
Yeah.
And what advice would you give to people who want to get into the ESG industry and people maybe think that they could do the exam and get a job, or what are your thoughts on it?
It really depends. I think it depends where you're applying and what those values are and where you are in your career. If that's something that you have the time and money for, that can be beneficial. But also there's a lot of different options that are more cost effective. There's some different courses online or different options that can kind of demonstrate you have the commitment to ESG and are interested in learning the knowledge and kind of provide similar signals without the time and money, because I know the CFA ESG exam can be quite expensive if you're paying for it yourself. I think it's more important kind of at the beginning of your career, or especially if you are not connected to the network. If you're coming in cold, one of the big things is knowing people in the industry or reaching out to people and talking to people, as well as demonstrating that you have a passion and demonstrating that you have an interest in the area and you're continually learning. The continuing learning is a really important way, and there's different ways to communicate that with or without having the CFA ESG exam. One thing I would recommend before taking the CFA ESG exam or doing any other course that takes a lot of time and money is to seek out people who have done it before on LinkedIn or online in different venues and ask them like how it was for them and how it was navigated and if it was beneficial for them. And you want to be tailoring it too, because in some areas, if you're like a CFA, having the CFA ESG really builds on the pre-existing subject matter. We obviously don't need to be a CFA to have it. But if you're doing, say, reporting, like the CFA ESG is less important, and being able to have effective written and oral communication skills is much more important than than the designate.
Yeah, that's a really good way of talking about the exam. That's one strategy, the CFA ESG exam, and it is expensive. I think I paid like £500 for the exam. It's over 100 hours of study. And there are other ways to get that information and to illustrate that you have a learning mindset and you're up to date.
Yeah, if it works for you, especially if you have an employer who's willing to pay for it and give you the time to study, why not? I've seen your landing land, but if you're taking it on yourself, it'd be good to think critically about different options.
Yeah. And then like when people reach out, are there any tips? For example, I think, like cultivating a relationship, or I know you said people in ESG want to help and are quite approachable and would like to support people, starting out in their career. But I also know that like if you've got a job, you've got only a certain amount of hours that you can devote to like helping people pro bono.
No, absolutely. So
Yeah.
I tend to try to talk to as many people as I can who reach out.
Mm-hmm.
I usually talk for about 20 minutes to half an hour, depending on my availability. The one big thing I look for if someone who's contacting me is a tailored message. Someone who is reaching out and saying, I saw you did X, Y, and Z, and this is why I specifically want to talk to you. Because that makes a lot of sense if people are interested in ESG risk management, or if they're interested, if they come from like the environmental world and they're trying to get into ESG, that makes a lot of sense for them to reach out to me. The messages I don't respond to or recommend people talk to other people or people talk to other individuals is when they're messaging me about reporting or proxy voting, or they're just sending me a generic message, which I know they've cut and pasted. Those I don't tend to respond to because I want to talk to people who are interested in talking to me. And that's something I recommend is people more than willing to help you. Just make sure you're choosing your people and tailoring the messages when you send them. Also, with LinkedIn, you can sometimes see the email address in the field and send them an email that way, or you can send them a message request. What's it called?
Yeah, a connection request on LinkedIn.
Yeah. When you send them a connection request on LinkedIn, you can write why you want to connect in there and why you're interested in them, rather than having to spend money to send like in mail, because I know everyone doesn't have that financial resource.
Yeah. And that's a good tip. And also, to do your homework and write a customized, like a tailored message, rather than a generic one. Yeah.
Yeah. A couple lines, and also come prepared. Like I get frustrated when people ask me about like ESG, or like asking me to like sell them on being an ESG. And I'm like that happened more before when I was less critical about who I accepted invitations from. But I felt like it was a waste of my time if the person wasn't interested or prepared to talk to me.
Yeah, exactly. Do your homework. What are the highs and the potential challenges of working within the field?
So the highs is doing interesting work that sometimes has an impact. The low is doing a lot of work that doesn't have the impact you expect. Institutions are sticky and they're tricky to navigate. And one thing I've realized over the course of my career is it doesn't matter how good my quantitative work is if I can't package it in a way that actually gets it used. And so I made that mistake probably much earlier in my career and realized that I needed to get better at my oral communication, my written communication, and it's kind of learning how to sell my ideas better. So the work I do actually kind of makes more of an impact or difference. And that is something that can be hard if you're a little numbers nerdy like me, that you didn't anticipate those skills having as much as an impact in your career. One of the other things is caring too much and having burnout. There is a big phenomenon in the industry is a lot of young women, especially, come in with a lot of like energy and passion, and then they get burnt out and leave the industry fairly quickly within a couple of years because they're putting so much of their heart and soul in it. And that's something I definitely had to learn, which is one of the reasons I went to government for a while, because it was kind of the work, but it was just a little less like stressful for me. And so now back into the mainstream ESG world, I've realized that I need to pick my battles and I can't care about everything. And so one of the things that I had to realize is my scope of influence. And so when you're dealing things like when you're dealing things regularly, like child labor or forced labor or like police brutality, extrajudicial murders, people dying as a result of criminal negligence. These are things you're talking about, which can be kind of hard to deal with. And so you have to find ways within yourself, realizing, okay, what is within or without my control? If you can't find a way to like figure out how to draw those boundaries and kind of let things go at the end of the day, it will kind of make you really stressed out. So things I do is I go walk in the woods with my dogs quite a bit. I also volunteer doing ESG work for nonprofits on the side. And that's the kind of way to have different scopes of influence beyond kind of my day to day, because even though it's ESG work, it's a different type that I enjoy.
Really. And a walk in the wood sounds so good with your dog.
One thing that is really special for me right now is I live in Edmonton, Alberta, which for those in the UK is oil sands country. I live in like the Texas of Canada, which can be hard for an ESG professional because there's such a focus and reliance on the energy industry. But that's also something that I see as a strength is I have a much better understanding of the energy industry than most others. It's because I have a really realistic interpretation of how these systems interact and how they can actually change, which feeds a lot into my energy transition work. That is actually not what I was going to say. What I was saying is because I live in Edmonton and work for a Toronto organization, I have lots of trees and woods around me rather than living in a different city where access to nature would be much more difficult.
Yeah. So it really helps you with honoring your boundaries and taking care of yourself better. How is it to work in different kinds of organizations like government, banks, the energy sector, environmental versus finance?
It is a huge range. You have to find what works for you. One thing that really matters to me is probably work-life balance over remuneration. So very clear, I get paid what I'm worth, but in my current organization, I don't have a bonus. But it also, one of the reasons I chose this organization is because it allows me to have much more creativity, interesting work, as well as probably less overall stress and the work-life balance. Working in institutional investors is also something I really enjoy because the beneficiaries, well, especially within pensions, the beneficiaries are very clear and has a different culture. Obviously, every organization has a different culture. Banks definitely has a little bit more of a stringent, probably a more traditional finance culture, which can be really good for some people. But I know other people who come from more the environmental world has struggled with retaining their authenticity. And also if you're working on the investment banking side, you're working a ton of hours. But also remuneration is many times what I currently make. Yes. So it's all about finding the role that's right for you. And I think one of the things that is hard, especially when you're starting your career, is realizing that you're interviewing the organization as much as they're interviewing you. And so at the start of my career, I know that it's very tempting to kind of take whatever you can get. And sometimes obviously you need to do that. But also it's really important to find an organization that's a good fit because that's where you will excel and you'll shine and you'll advance. And one problem that is less common now is ESG professionals are starting to be paid what they're worth and be more comparable to other professionals in that rank. Whereas when I started, ESG professionals were paid considerably less. And so I think it's a really good reflection on how ESG is being valued within these other organizations. And government is very good for work-life balance. I mean, I enjoyed working with government. Some of my favorite people I've ever worked with are in government, but ultimately it was kind of the bureaucratic processes that made it really difficult to make change. And that change management was something that made me ultimately kind of want to leave because in government, you're at the whims of who's elected. And so halfway through my career in government, a new government came in with a totally opposite political ideology, and everything I'd worked on for years had completely shifted. So even though my team was excellent, that pivot in ideology made it really hard to kind of keep momentum in my job.
Yeah, those are such interesting points. And I love also what you said about consciously being clear on what you're going for. Remuneration is lower in the hierarchy than work-life balance. And I really love that. I think I'm the same. After a certain amount of money and that you've got your needs taken care of, it can slide back to secondary position or lower.
And also for me, I know I'm very internally motivated. I'm not externally motivated. So having a bonus for me is excellent. I like it, but it's not something that changes me fundamentally on a day-to-day working. And also bonuses are really hard in the ESG world if you're not a portfolio manager because a lot of our goals are so generic and intangible or outside our control. And so that's something to be aware of if you in an organization with a bonus and you're in one of these more reporting or different roles, likely you won't be at the top end of the bonus, or you won't be on the low end. You'll probably just be kind of consistently in the middle because the performance metrics are just kind of harder to establish.
Yeah, I hear you. I work more in the investment and finance world, and you can more easily measure output, bonus, financial accounts.
It's much, it's much easier for side of professionals, but I'm sure ESG professionals are not the only ones who kind of have this intangible bonus remuneration aspect.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about how ESG is in everything? I don't know if you follow some of the UK news, but recently we had an energy supplier called Centrica, which was sending bailiffs to vulnerable people's homes and fitting energy meters, smart meters, women who are breastfeeding, like really financially vulnerable people, and like really strong arming their way in. And they announced, huge profits. And I don't think sometimes we see the connection between those kind of events happening, or like on our previous call, you mentioned Abbott Laboratories, milk, bacteria, and a milk shortage in the US for babies.
Yeah.
Like the connection between life and standards in corporations, non-financial standards.
No, absolutely. ESG has a really huge implication, like with corporations, to how they treat their population. And that's one thing that's kind of hard to see. Is also it's hard to see because ESG events, I see there's two things. There's event risk, which is kind of an instantaneous event, and erosion risk, which is something that happens over time. And a lot of things are slow and then sudden. And what you can see with ESG is these red flags if you're not a good corporate citizen, if you're prioritizing the short-term profits. Like if you look deeper, these things kind of accumulate over time. And so there's a lag between negative action and kind of impact on share price or impact on perception of the company. And so you can kind of grab those short-term profits, but eventually you get in the media, eventually you're called out, eventually you have risks. So Rio Tinto is an example of a company that I think that was more even though it was a freak event, it was most statistically likely because they've had issues in the past where they've destroyed historical sites. They have a history of sexual assault and sexual harassment within their company that was undealt with. And so these are things where they eventually come back to manifest. And that's the hard thing about being kind of in the ESG world is you see these systemic inequities where people are being taken advantage of. And although people are getting profits, sometimes it's hard to communicate how these actions now are going to manifest or it could be risks in the future. And that's something I'm currently always working on because it is hard to communicate where record profits right now could be seen positively. But if you're doing something that harms your customer base or you do something that harms your country or community, that probably won't turn out the greatest, in the long term. I think we've seen that kind of time and time again where the more kind of red flags or unethical behavior eventually kind of gets penalized, whether it's through landslides, killing kind of indigenous communities again, or increased regulation. A lot of these negative things rely on taking advantage of externalities or lax government regulation. And once those loopholes are closed, they won't have the opportunity to make the profit. And often laws come in as a result of corporations taking advantage of their consumer base.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know you said you don't really believe in karma, but maybe there's corporation karma. It seems like with social media, there is a backlash and it's quite instantaneous and it can be communicated across pictures and videos very quickly across the world.
So that's something I look at, is when I'm doing research on companies is looking at social media impressions or who have campaigns. And so the entity Sleeping Giants was really big a couple years ago. And so I kind of saw if Sleeping Giants of a company, so they're an activist organization, but if they started targeting you, there was a high percentage chance that you'd kind of come out in the media because they're very good in their research. And so that was something that people should be aware of. And also it's the 3% rule. And I don't know the academic validity to this, but within social change, it says that if 3% of a population cares about something or demands change, it's likely that's the tipping point.
Oh,
so that's cool. Kind of see if I'm if things are kind of a one-off. So kind of looking at the momentum of media mentions and stuff being okay, this is really starting to pick up speed. And also it really depends kind of on your customer base. Cause we saw that a couple of years ago with Whole Foods and especially you're going to get backlash if you're selling yourself as a certain type of company. You need to have actions that align with it. And you have the benefits of people paying a premium, but also you have the risk of a consumer base who has the time and energy to mobilize against you.
Yeah. And also bringing it back to systems, I wanted to talk about, there's only so much an ESG finance manager or even somebody who votes, towards making changes at the board level. There's only so much that impact they can have because let's say it's about mining standards and it's a country in Africa and there's corruption in that government and they employ children, but the paperwork shows otherwise. There's only so much that somebody in finance can do to influence that situation. And that can be quite frustrating. I struggle a little bit with, investing the way you want the world to be and investing the way the world is. There is a gap, and I suppose, how do you manage your self feelings, your own grief and your own rage about, that gap?
So, and that's definitely something I struggle with, because like the way I view ESG, or like the way it's used within my work, it's more like a risk management, more about value, as I say, over values. And so I don't really have an opportunity to consider like the social impact, or like kind of the impact investing side to my work. Like, I believe that if ESG risk is taken into account, there's often positive change about that, but it's not really the prime objective of what I'm doing. But I think that's kind of the way to start for me, because if you look at the assets under management that are doing ESG for value rather than values, that's definitely more. Like, impact investing is still like a fairly small space, and it's a very important space, but it definitely is dwarfed by kind of the mainstream like ESG movement. And one thing that gives me hope is the activist community. So I consider myself more of a reformer. So like, I work within a system to make change, and I really respect the activists who are out there. You can see the progress that is happening. And I think kind of keeping your ear to the ground is something that gives me hope. Even the changes in the past couple of years, and the amount of action that's happened on climate reporting, like palm oil or deforestation in the Amazon as a result of like farming. Well, fingers crossed it's changing. But like the companies within themselves have implemented different standards, or taking child labor seriously. Like, I think one of the biggest changes now I've seen that's not really explicitly talked about as much, well, it is within the ESG community, but probably not the broader community, is it's no longer acceptable to feign surprise if you have slave or child labor or ESG risk within your supply chain. Like, I think that with the Rana Plaza collapse, a decade, or I really should know the date, but that was one of the seminal moments in my early career. And a lot of companies were like, oh, we didn't know. And certain ones got away with it. And now if the same thing happened, they would be held accountable, probably not legally, but by the shareholders. Feigning ignorance is no longer acceptable. And I think even these small changes within corporate responsibility and the scope of influence give me a lot of hope for how this direction is, how the direction's going, even if they aren't as fast or as robust as I personally would like. And I think that's a big thing, like in ESG, if you're working in these organizations, is meeting people where they're at, speaking their language, learning the motivations, and being connected to your work, and being seen as an ally, knowing what's happening kind of within all these different communities, but being able to create networks and opportunities that really weren't there before.
And not a blind judgment, just sort of advocating for the requirements that we would like corporations to have certain standards for, but not a personal judgment for people who don't believe in ESG. Or like, I have clients who want to invest ethically and sustainably, and then I also have clients when I start my business who don't. I really want there to be freedom for me not to impose my standards and values and beliefs onto, my clients and my colleagues.
No, I totally understand, because making the world better, like, sounds so cliche.
Yeah.
And I'm in the work because it's interesting, but also because I care a lot about making the world better. I think that comes back to like the systems versus the individual, and knowing that with every negative thing that's happened there's an incredible amount of reinforcing systems that made that possible. It's not just one choice. It's not just one action. It's a cascading series of events. And that's why like trying to look closer and understand the root causes is so important, because even superficial commitments, like especially when we saw at the beginning of the net zero movement, a lot of people were committing to net zero without actually understanding what it meant, because it was like the cool and trendy thing to do without an actual pathway to net zero. And so I think that's looking critically at different entities or different organizations and understanding that you can have less climate risk without like a fossil fuel divestment policy, or like different risk management policies, or you can have like a fossil fuel exclusion policy and have it very like in a certain, like with certain carve outs that let you to have extreme amounts of risk to fossil fuels. So I think it's always about looking beyond the surface and asking questions.
Right. Wow, you're so eloquent and articulate on ESG. I'm just like loving every word. One last question is favorite books to learn or read about ESG for beginners, somebody who doesn't know anything about it, and then maybe somebody who's like more established.
For me, a lot of my information comes from Twitter and LinkedIn, but I understand that's hard if like you don't already have the network built out. Book on beginner ESG. Nope, totally forget.
No, that's fine.
I guess for the middle, there's a book that just came out on SSRN called the ESG Handbook. It's more of a textbook, but it's a really good introduction to everything. And also it's open source. One of the things is I think there's a lot of really good stuff coming out of the UK, and it really depends on kind of where you want to learn. A lot of my information comes from reading newsletters, trying to understand what's happening, keeping up on current events. And I think of the hard things is disaggregating current events from kind of the rhetoric. Because as you said, there's a lot of people who are kind of misusing the term and controversy over things that like either shouldn't be controversy or understanding how these mechanics actually work. And so I think it's important to think critically. One of the really interesting things for me, or like really exciting things for me, is there's so many more opportunities. So one of the things about my job is every role I've had, I'm the first person to ever hold that role, which is really good for me because I thrive in that environment. But I think it's just a testament to how fast this kind of space is evolving. And so when I look and Google ESG jobs now, or like especially internships, there's tons of opportunities for people to get into organizations and kind of test the waters to see if that's something you want. But that being said, one thing that I know can be frustrating is you're hearing all these rhetoric about explosion in ESG jobs and how there's such a demand for skills. But that doesn't always translate into being able to get a job easy. The jobs are actually like quite competitive, and that's importance of kind of expanding your network and keep trying. One of the other things is getting used to hearing no or used to rejection. And that's something, it's a really good lesson. Like when you're applying for jobs, being able to like tailor the applications and like just knowing that a small percentage of probably will lead to interviews. And also if you don't get a job, asking for feedback or trying to find out what areas you can either strengthen on or what areas that you have a deficit in, or if there's a certain skills that you can improve on. And so that's one thing I did early in my career that kind of helped out. Like I remember one very memorable interview where it was very clear that I was vibing with one of the interviewers, but another one, like, and you just like weren't on the same level. And so after I kind of asked for feedback and there was like, well, you're our top candidate, but this other person like just said, no, it's like a non-negotiable. And so that led to feedback and me understanding that like, I'm not everyone's cup of tea and kind of enforcing the idea that I'd rather be my authentic self than fit into a mold that doesn't work. And so in interviews, I tried to be myself as much as possible because I want to see if that resonates with them, because I want to be in organizations that are a good fit for me. Being able to put yourself out there and hear no is really important, because that's something also you're going to counter in the ESG space is despite all the exciting developments, despite everything that's happening in organizations, you're going to be sought out for help, but also you're going to do work and people probably won't listen to you, or like you feel like people don't listen to you and like you're constantly kind of having to push these ideas uphill and sell these ideas. So getting used to understanding that this is a continual like iterative process is something that is important, and also taking wins where you can get them. Like overall, I feel incredibly fortunate that I've landed in the ESG space because it's a fantastic fit for me. And I know that I will be here in a while. And one thing that makes me very excited is everything's developing so fast. So who knows where I'll be in the next 5 years, 10 years. I'll probably be in an area of ESG that probably won't even be called ESG and doesn't even exist now.
Yeah. So exciting. Everything that you said was so good. And especially, not taking it personally, to use feedback and to take in and improve your skills where you can, but also to be uncompromising about who you are and to be your authentic self. I think that's so important. You can't be like a chameleon for different employers, and it's much better to be true to yourself. Yeah, I agree with that completely.
One big thing I changed personally while in the industry is how I dressed.
Right.
Like I'm not my most formal self wearing suits. or wearing like a skirt and jacket is something that I never did prior. But I realized that when I wore that, people were more receptive to my ideas because I probably looked more like the club. That was more like what I was on the institutional investor side. And that was kind of a hard lesson for me because at first I felt inauthentic, but then I realized that I could still be the same person inside and be saying the same things if my dress looked different. But that being said, is you have to find your own boundaries or find what you're willing to change or not change. Yeah. And I had to figure that out for myself.
Agree. And me too. I used to wear, when I first worked in the bank, I used to wear a jacket, but I would wear like a t-shirt vest inside. And my branch manager said, will you stop wearing t-shirts to work? And I was like, oh no. How does he know?
One of the hardest things that always cracks me up is the emergence of kind of Patagonia into finance. Right. And like kind of North Face and like kind of the different like brands, because those were very big in the environmental movement, and kind of seeing those more things becoming a little bit more informal, especially with the pandemic. Yeah. But I feel like that's something that's become full circle, because that's much more the wardrobe I'm comfortable with.
Yeah. I actually covered the label for the whole interview. Alexandria, it looks good. Yeah. Thank you. I have so many Patagonia clothes. I love that brand so much. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure, and I really appreciate it. I just reached out to you via a Twitter DM. I mean, I follow you but you know, you have 6,000 followers, and I'm really humbled that you took the time to talk to me. And I'm sure this information that you've just shared is going to be so helpful to many people embarking on their careers in ESG. So very, very, very grateful. Thank you.
You're welcome. Have a wonderful day.